Okay, ladies and gents, we might get started. Firstly, welcome to the Climate and Energy College and the Energy Transition Hub. My name is Nick Parry. I'm a PhD student here. It's my great pleasure to host a very interesting seminar today. Before we begin, I would just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders past and present. As I said, today we have a very interesting seminar. It's the second in a series of the Energy Transition Hub seminars looking at the energy transition in coal communities. Probably a seminar that has increased in relevance since the federal election, I think. We talk a lot about the climate aspect of transitions. We talk a lot about the engineering and economic challenges. But perhaps a blind spot in our political discourse, at least, is the impacts and the opportunities for the communities in those coal regions that are affected by the transition. I think until we talk about all of those three coherently, we're probably not going to advance the energy transition in this country. Fortunately, we have two people today who are doing a lot of work in this area and have done some fantastic things already. They are Professor Lars Koenen and Professor Leo, Professor Leo G. He is going to indulge my own ignorance and not make me pronounce his surname. But it is a lovely surname, I'm told, in Dutch. But both experts. Lars joined MSSI in January 2017 as the inaugural City of Melbourne Chair of Resilient Cities. That's an initiative between the City of Melbourne and the University of Melbourne. He's currently working on action research that analyses the implementation of the Resilient Melbourne strategy and on the development of a smart specialisation strategy to grow regional resilience in Gippsland, which is our main coal region. Professor Leo, he's the director of the L.H. Martin Institute at the University of Melbourne. His background is in higher education policy and research, but he has a lot of expertise in institutional change and innovation systems, which he is also applying to the Gippsland region. So, big round of applause. We're just going to start with Lars and then move on to Leo.
Yeah. All right. This should be working. Yeah, good, terrific. Okay, welcome and thanks for venturing through this very European weather to come to the seminar. So yeah, Leo and I am going to do this presentation together. It's basically just an introduction, elaboration of our project, Gippsland Smart Specialisation Strategy, that we are currently involved in for the Latrobe Valley Authority, which started last year. This is a project that's done in collaboration with RMIT, and Emma Shortis, one of our project members, is also here today, and Bruce Wilson from the EU Centre, colleague of Emma, who is currently already in Europe for a round of conferences and visits there. So, as I said, Leo and I are going to cut this up. I'll do a bit of the introduction. I'll try and explain what this elusive concept of smart specialization really means and where it comes from and how we're trying to bring it into practice in an Australian context. So let's start with that. So first of all, maybe a bit of a zoom out and sort of trying to contextualize smart specialization. It's a concept that's basically been developed and brought to the attention of policymakers by regional economists and economic geographers. It's a concept very much sort of coming out of regional development theory. And one of its key proponents, Andres Rodriguez Pous, has also recently termed the term revenge of the places that don't matter and sort of positioned discussions about regional development in sort of trends of where the global economy is going. So, while some say we are currently facing a triumph of the city, and we increasingly see how wealth is becoming concentrated in our cities, how increasingly innovation and technological change is concentrating in cities, we see that there's also a sort of a political, social backlash to those patterns of concentration. And that sort of backlash is happening through voting behavior. And that's what Andres has dubbed the revenge of the places that don't matter. So let's have a look at Brexit. How did the Brexit vote sort of pan out geographically? Most against votes for Brexit were located in London, whereas the leave votes were very much located, so to say, in the regional and rural communities of the UK. Similar or sort of similar patterns you could find in the US, where votes against Trump were primarily in the big cities on the coasts, on the east and the west coast of the US, whereas the votes for Trump were very much located in the center of the US. And what Andres has sort of mapped out is sort of similar voting patterns across a number of other developed economies, France, Germany, Hungary, where sort of the narrative is more or less the same. The wealthy cities tend to vote for progressive politics, but populism is increasingly on the rise in sort of regional and rural electorates, where people feel like they are not really profiting from the wealth that's being generated in cities. And that feeling of being left behind is being translated into votes for populism, both on the left and on the right. So, as was already alluded to, did the recent election results at the federal level in Australia also signify some sort of revenge of the places that don't matter? A lot of commentary has been around especially the voting outcomes in Queensland. And a lot of progressive politicians, scholars, feel that Queensland was sort of, voting against climate politics and, all the discussion that also has been around Adani. So, I mean, it's a bit too early to perhaps, really take scientific stock with what happened and what the ramification and implications of the recent election results will be. But it does perhaps point to a widening polarization that we're also witnessing in Australia between the urban and the regional. This is just an overview of growth rates in Victoria. But what you could basically see is that the growth gap between Melbourne and regional Victoria is increasing over time, right? So I said, we've been trying to work with this concept of smart specialization, and acknowledging very much that that's a very European concept. Let's have a look at some of the sort of trends in regional development happening in Europe. And this is a map and some findings that came out of a big EU project, which looked at the capacity of regions across Europe to be resilient in the face of the global financial crisis. So it looked at which regions have been able to bounce back from the global financial crisis in terms of growth and in terms of employment. And that sort of capacity to bounce back, the resilience of those regions, was then sort of plotted against their capacity to innovate. And quite consistent findings came out there, if you would exclude the Polish regions for some statistical reasons. But you would find that there was a very strong correlation between those regions that were able to basically bounce out of the global financial crisis and their capacity to innovate. Innovation leaders, innovation followers were clearly more resistant to crisis than moderate and modest innovators. Unfortunately, we would not be able to do this kind of exercise here in Australia because we don't have granular and high quality data on innovation performance of regions. But we'll probably come back to that in a bit. So that already tells us something about that innovation seems to matter for regions to be resilient. But this was primarily sort of in the face of economic shocks. There's also case evidence about how regions are responding perhaps also to economic, but also in the face of sort of being a coal region that is facing a shock of transitioning out of coal. And for that, we've looked at the Ruhr Valley in Germany, which was basically up until the 50s, 60s, one of the hearts of coal and iron production in Europe, but which has shed most of its jobs in those sectors over the following decades. So the Ruhr Valley basically made a transition from being a really sort of the heartland of coal production in Europe to out of coal. But that was not an easy process. And I think there's a lot to be learned from the lessons of the Ruhr Valley, particularly in terms of what kind of policies could be effective in facilitating communities to transition out of coal. Just interesting to note here is that the initial response to sort of the crisis of the coal industry in the region was also basically to just pump a lot of money back into the industry, trying not so much to provide resilience, but rather to provide sort of relief. And there's a famous quote from one of the industrial leaders also, Prof, who said, what the Ruhr needs is muscles, we don't need brains, right? So initially, a lot of the policies that was trying to target sort of the deindustrialization of the Ruhr area were very much sort of just short-term and very much sort of speaking to the interests of the vested interests. And in a sense, in the way of a more sort of fundamental restructuring, economic restructuring process in the region. And it was only after really a lot of sort of failed policies were put in place with attraction of foreign direct investment, setting up branch plants in other industries, but the unemployment rates kept on being very low, and the region remained to be in crisis. And that's where the point when the state government decided, okay, we have to fundamentally rethink how we're going to deal with the Ruhr area. And that's when they sort of shifted perspective from sort of trying to re-industrialize the Ruhr to what they call a neo-industrialization process, where they really sort of try to sort of bring in new industry into the region that was based on existing skills and competences. And in that sense, this is sort of an historical example, I think, of what smart specialization is really about. An interesting sort of an aspect of this case is that sort of the implementation of the new sort of policies to restructure the Ruhr really required also an institutional change and an institutional reform in the region. Whereas initially, a lot of the sort of the relief policies were very much top-down and driven by state governments, sort of the subsequent waves of policies were also opening up for a governance model which really tried to work with communities, which worked with local governments, which tried to sort of have a more associative governance structure. And I think that's, again, something that also we'll find coming back into the notion of smart specialization. So back again to Australia. So what we're primarily doing in our project is to think through and bring into practice sort of new approaches to regional policy and sort of applying that on a coal region, Latrobe Valley, and we've sort of extended that to Gippsland. So obviously, let's have a look then at how is regional policy sort of shaped in Australia. And it's really interesting in that sense that we're speaking in Australia often of a dual economy. We've got sort of, we sort of define regional Australia by what it's not, by it not being part of the metropolitan areas of this country. Regional Victoria is everything except Melbourne. That's a completely different way of talking about regions than in Europe. In Europe, you would talk about city regions. A region is sort of the hinterland, but is also part of a big city. But because of historical reasons, there is a really different understanding of the regional and the urban in Australia. So we find also that that has really implications for the space economy, the spatial economy of this country, where the regions have been for many years and decades responsible for a lot of wealth generation by extracting resources, and a lot of those resources being very carbon intensive. And that wealth has been sort of being basically captured in the cities through the development of financial services and so on, where the headquarters also of a lot of the sort of extractive industries were located. And that sort of has created this sort of quite fractured spatial economy, where you've got these sort of extractive regional economies, and you've got sort of very metropolitan, dynamic knowledge economies in the cities of Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Perth, and so on and so on. And at the same time, we're seeing that gap, that income gap between regional and urban Australia seems to be widening. And at the same time, policy makers across all levels are having difficulties sort of dealing with that. Commentary, often on the basis of regions in Australia being in crisis, are often along the lines of, we don't have a joined up government approach. Local, state, and federal governments are not able to collaborate, are often having sort of competing policy objectives, and so on and so on. So there's, yes, Andrew Beer wrote recently, Australian governments don't work with each other and it's holding back regional economies in trouble, right? And that is something you can certainly assert for the Latrobe Valley. Another challenge that Australian regions have is that regional policy tends to be sort of framed in terms of infrastructure deficiencies. So whereas in Europe, thinking about regional policy and regional development, it's often about, regional capabilities, regional innovation. The sort of the default in Australia is, if regions are in trouble, we need to make massive investments in infrastructure. We need to sort of basically improve the purchasing capacity on the demand side of regions, but there's very little attention to actually policy that addresses the supply side and sort of the structure of the economy, right? And one of the sort of examples is the recent report coming out of the Productivity Commission on transitioning regional economies. I think it was published December 2017. Very little about innovation, about skills and capabilities of regional economies. Hardly any mention on climate change. So again, this was, a very interesting but also strange document, reading it from a European perspective. So then let's have a look at how the sort of the innovation policy of this country look like. It's quite ambitious in terms of what it wants to aim for. And Malcolm Turnbull a few years ago, I think, really realized that Australia cannot continue to rely on just extracting resources out of the ground, and needs to make that transition to a knowledge economy. But his sort of idea of, we need to transition from a resource boom to an idea boom went basically flat. A lot of people, there was a lot of resistance because people were primarily afraid that it would sort of lose their job. But also the rhetorics did not really, there was not really sort of a reform or an implementation of new policy or policy instruments that was following that shift in rhetorics. I mean, we do have a national innovation and research strategy, but that is basically plays blind. It does not acknowledge that Australia is the most urbanized country in the world and what that would mean, for example, for the national innovation system, nor does it really engage with the innovation challenges and the development challenges of regional Australia. And when we're talking about sort of, instruments to then sort of lift innovation, it's primarily about what would be the optimal level of R&D rebate that we give to companies. And it's not talking at all about sort of a more sophisticated sort of policy portfolio of how you could improve the innovation system. But it basically reduces it to a very simple market failure issue. So that brings us then to our region and what has been happening in the wake of the closure of Hazelwood, the decision that was taken by the French energy multinational ENGIE in March 2017. State of Victoria sort of was very much aware of sort of the significance of this event, and immediately announced a lot of funding to help communities in the valley to transition out of sort of being a coal region. Some of it was quite traditional. 50 million was being earmarked for establishment of an economic growth zone, tax concessions to attract economic and industrial activity to the region, and the other 174 million were earmarked for community infrastructure and investment funds, where primarily, again, it was a scattergun approach in a lot of infrastructure investments. But what was really interesting was that the state government set up a institutional sort of, or set up a authority to oversee this process of transitioning the Latrobe Valley, the Latrobe Valley Authority, which was in a sense a bit of a policy or an institutional experiment, as it was sort of working both with local governments and state governments and different members of community and business to really think through about, you know, what could be a strategy for a region to sort of make sure that we are actually resilient in the face of coal firepower plants closures and so on. And as part of the sort of the setup of that Latrobe Valley Authority, they also realized that they, in their own words, they ran out of policy options that they were familiar with. So they sort of realized that what, you know, our default in terms of how we do regional policy in Victoria or in Australia is not going to really cut it to deal with the restructuring that we're facing in the Latrobe Valley. And that sort of got them really interested in the notion of smart specialization and the practices around that in Europe. So just a short then history of the smart specialization concept. As I've said, it has its origins in European regional technology and innovation policy. Maybe most interestingly, it also comes out of an experiment that was done in Europe at the end of the 80s, where regional policy was really sort of trying to work with regional partners, with industry, with academia, with community, to identify gaps in regional technology networks, and then to see how European structural funds, how European cohesion policy could help those local firms to access those technologies. And that experiment, you could even call it sort of a bit of a niche, has really managed to mainstream and become a regime now for regional policy in the European Union. Where in 2007 we saw that regional policy in the EU even more shifted towards a focus on innovation, and where all regions in Europe now really have to have an innovation strategy in place in order to access that massive amount of EU funding that's available for regional development. Still, up to 2014, a lot of that policies was the typical let's create a high-tech precinct in our region. Let's have a IT cluster, or let's have a life science cluster, because that's what's happening in Silicon Valley, and that's what the new economy is all about. But as you can perhaps hear in the sort of the irony in my voice, these policies were absolutely not successful. And what smart specialization is really sort of a departure from is that idea that you could sort of just import policy recipes from successful regions elsewhere. But smart specialization really put upfront that for regions to become, to access EU regional funding, they first need to do an analysis of their regional economy. They need to do an analysis of their regional innovation system to identify what are their strengths and weaknesses, what are their assets, their resources, their networks, their capabilities, and make a strategy that is informed by that analysis, in order to access EU funding. Otherwise, you won't be able as a region to access that funding. Also, you need to show that you have a working partnership with other sectors in the region. So it's not just a sort of a strategy that is being developed and implemented by government. It's a strategy that's coming from a collaboration between industry, government, academia, civil society, right? So in that sense, it was quite a radical reform for Europe to start drawing on this notion of smart specialization. And you could say it's currently the world's largest and boldest new industrial policy experiment, following a lot of the sort of the thought leadership that comes from people like Sable, Hausmann, Roderick, and Mazzucato. So what then the European Union also did is basically provide a manual and a platform to help regions develop and implement smart specialization strategies. And that sort of manual has a couple of design principles. As I said earlier on, before you make a strategy, it really needs to be informed by a robust analysis of the regional innovation system. And based on that analysis, the region needs to show where it's going to make sort of priorities in terms of what areas of industrial activity are going to be prioritized and are going to be selected for support. So to sort of make informed decisions about where to concentrate investment. A third sort of element of that manual is that it requires broad stakeholder involvement. In EU jargon, the quadruple helix of local government, industry, academia, and civil society. And as a fourth sort of element of these strategies is they need to be constantly monitored and evaluated. Basically acknowledging that these policies won't get it right from the start. And that is not then to sort of, see whether taxpayers' money is being well spent, but to acknowledge that policy is also very much a process of learning and of iteration and of making mistakes. And in that sense, sort of the European Union realizes that they've got a fantastic sort of policy laboratory across all the regions in the EU to set up policy experiments, and by sort of closely monitoring them to find out, what policies are working in what places and what policies are not. And that's sort of what's currently happening. You saw that the smart specialization sort of program has only been sort of introduced in 2014. So as we speak, regions and Europe is sort of finding out how that implementation is going about. And in doing so also is bumping its head on a number of heroic assumptions around, the notion of smart specialization. A recent piece by colleagues Marquez and Morgan has already pointed that out, that the way that smart specialization is being implemented in Southern Europe, Eastern Europe is entirely different from the way it's being implemented in places like Scandinavia or Germany. And one of the real sort of struggles, and I think there we kind of come back also to our work here in Gippsland, is the so-called innovation paradox. That sort of from a sort of cohesion perspective, you want particularly lesser developed regions to profit from public investments in development and innovation. But notably, it's those regions that lack the absorptive capacity to actually leverage those public investments. So what you typically get is, if you invest in lesser developed regions, you get least sort of return for investment from a government perspective. And that is all to do with sort of the quality of the institutions and the quality of government in those places. So typically, those places that are actually already performing well in terms of being innovative also get the most out of public investments. And that's why increasingly the whole notion of smart specialization is about institutional reform and really improving sort of the institutions of regional economies to leverage also investments in innovation. Right, I'll leave it there. And Leo is now going to tell us what we're really doing in the project.
Right. Yeah, lots of theory, I'm practice. And I must practice as well. It's fascinating. I mean, for me, it's probably the most interesting project I've been working on for years. It's absolutely fascinating trying to achieve positive change. When we started this, we made it very clear to the Latrobe Valley Authority and the people we were working with that we were not going to fix Gippsland. I mean, the history of Gippsland is a region where a lot has been done to it and very little has been done with it. So we're about doing it with the communities in Gippsland. I think when we did our analysis bit, we came to the conclusion that there are about 53 plans for the redevelopment of Gippsland over the last 10 years or something like that. And none of them have been implemented. Lars already mentioned the lack of data. And that's a serious problem in Australia. I mean, both Lars and I are from the Netherlands, where we have not only very different culture, but we actually use data to inform decision making. When you talk about innovation, I mean, it's really quite strange. You go to the ABS and you can find innovation data at the federal level. So Australia as a country, you can't find anything. It's simply not available at a regional level. They can't break it down for you. That is bizarre. I mean, it has to do with the cuts that we've imposed on the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It also has to do with, as Lars already mentioned, the neglect of regions. So we can't sort of create the statistical picture for Gippsland. So we have to rely on qualitative data. So we've done an immense number of interviews with people across Gippsland to get a feel for what's happening. When we started, that was before Victoria went to the elections, and the Latrobe Valley Authority was very careful in pointing us into the direction of food and fiber, because that was an uncontested political area. Everybody agrees that food and fiber, so agriculture, is important for Victoria. We were not to touch energy at that time. That was way too politically sensitive. So we didn't. We started out with food and fiber and tried to figure what was happening there. And the good thing was that they have sort of a cluster organization. So there's the East Gippsland Food Cluster and there's Agribusiness Gippsland. One looking primarily at dairy, Agribusiness Gippsland, one looking primarily at horticulture, East Gippsland Food Cluster. But that there was sort of coordinated action, at least we thought it was. And it was for that particular sector with those particular people. But as Lars already said, principle of stakeholder involvement is that it's government, industry, tertiary education, and communities. So we spoke to all of those people in those domains. And the funny thing is that they're all very willing to talk to you, but they don't talk to each other. So therefore, our project had the subtitle Connecting Gippsland. Because what's happened, and it's, I think, very illustrative for regional policy development or non-policy development in Australia, that stakeholders are completely siloed. That's true for government and its subdivisions. So at the state level, we've got a range of departments doing stuff in Gippsland, but they don't talk to each other. We've got a lot of local government actors that don't talk to each other, in fact, compete with each other. When you look at tertiary education, we don't collaborate. We compete very strongly. That's very unhelpful when you've got a region like Gippsland, which is as big as Lars and my home country, the Netherlands. And it's got one university, Federation University, which is headquartered in Ballarat, with a small campus, Churchill, in Victoria, and what's now called TAFE, Gippsland, which is scattered all over the region and was essentially almost dead when we started. It's now been rebuilt and rebranded, which is a really good thing, and it's become a more proactive actor in Gippsland. But at the time when we started, relationships between tertiary education and community didn't really exist. And industry was as siloed as anything. So horticulture people don't talk to agriculture people, and none of them talk much to governments except for, can I please have some money? The other problem is that when you think about agriculture, it is a large industry in Gippsland. It is in part a rich industry and in part a very poor industry. The poor part are the small family farms that are scattered across the region. They're doing it tough. The big companies are very comfortable, which is not a good recipe for innovation. And so they've got their set customers, Coles, Woolies, and the big markets. And yes, there's competition amongst some of the larger companies, but by and large, they've carved up the market and they're quite comfortable doing what they do. So innovation is dependent on individual initiative. And so we met one of the growers, and he'd gone to the Netherlands to buy a washing straight for his veggies, automated washing. It's good innovation. And every year he flies in a Dutch mechanic to do the maintenance for that machine. It's not being shared amongst the other growers, because why should they? So you have innovation, but it's very individualized, and it's not shared very much. So that's what we started doing. And the good thing is that people are thinking about increasing productivity in food and fiber. And there's massive opportunity because productivity is pretty low. And through what is called the entrepreneurial discovery process, which is a series of workshops that we run with people from the quadruple helix, you start identifying potential areas of strength and innovation. And that worked pretty well for food and fiber, because through the cluster organization, there were some ideas of where progress could be made, innovation could be made, and growth could be created. So that sort of moved along reasonably well. We learned a lot. That was very helpful when we started moving into the new energy space, which is what we're doing currently. And there, again, the story is the same about disconnectedness and a lot of things happening. There's actually quite a bit of initiative in Gippsland across the new energy space, but it's totally disconnected. People don't talk to each other. So when we organized our sort of inventory meetings and we brought people together, they all of a sudden found out that there were about 4 people doing the same research on innovative potential in new energy, but they'd never spoken to each other. So we're now getting them together. They start speaking to each other, which is really good. But one of the fascinating things we've now discovered in our workshops on new energy, and they range from, let's say, community energy hubs to bioenergy, to geothermal, to smart grids, and then all of that stuff. There's an enormous potential for innovation across Gippsland, but the energy people are not talking to the agriculture people. And there's an enormous potential for growth in agriculture by being smart about energy. The large energy users, especially in dairy. We hardly have greenhouses in Gippsland. We've got geothermal energy, which can be used very efficiently to heat greenhouses. And greenhouses can be extremely helpful when you start to deal with climate change and you want to make use of more efficient use of the land that you have. So far, I think it's that complacency part that is bedeviling a bit of the agenda, in the sense that, well, but we've got so much land, why should we use greenhouses? And we still got an abundance of water. Well, we may have for now, but in the years to come, that's going to be an issue. So slowly but steadily, I think what is the strength of smart specialization as a process is that you start connecting up people and you start having a conversation of different groups around the table that hadn't taken place before. Now, it takes time for people to actually understand that, and it takes time for people to actually understand the language in which others are speaking, but we're getting there. I'm not saying that this is a finished process, not at all. It's only the start. And it's not going to end in 3 years' time with a completely revisioned and reimagine Gippsland, where everybody's happily collaborating and working together and being friends and doing wonderful things. That's not going to be the case, but it's a start of a process that's longer term in terms of regional policy, regional development, that shows the importance of having an authority like the Latrobe Valley Authority as a policy actor, bringing different strands together. I mean, clearly, what isn't there is a monitoring and evaluation system, so we're setting that up. We're entering into workshops with people in government to make them understand that data is really important, to figure out what data actually exists in the different domains of government and what needs to be done in order to build an effective monitoring and evaluation system. Because in the absence of that, we need another productivity commission report to demonstrate what's happening in regional development. I mean, it's very strange when you come from a culture where policy evaluation is an integral part of policy making, policy development, policy analysis. And you come to a country where that isn't the case. And it's very weird because in my field, higher education, Australia used to have a very, very strong policy evaluation framework. This was in the 1990s. It was being completely destroyed under the Howard government because it created transparency and you could actually see what the effect of policy implementation was, and you could actually learn from policy failure. Well, imagine that you can learn from policy failure. That doesn't exist anymore, which is really a very negative element of public policy in Australia. We really should be focusing on monitoring and evaluation. We should not have to rely on national commissions, national inquiries and all that sort of stuff. It should be part and parcel of the regular policy making process, that you are looking at what you've done, that you're basing that on evaluative data, and that you are accountable for what you've done with public resources. It's a very basic principle of public policy, and it's not the strongest point in this country. Now, having said that, it has been an absolute privilege working with people at the different layers of government for this particular project. We've found an enormous amount of support, and people actually enjoy talking to other people, also at the policy level. But it's just that the institutional framework that we find in a number of other countries isn't that explicit or doesn't exist that strongly in Australia. So that's part of what we're trying to build, a true institutional framework in the neo-institutional sense of the word. Because if that is there, you've got an inherent strength for further regional development. So that's part of what is behind the Smart Specialization Manual. I mean, it certainly isn't as explicit in the manual and in the EU documentation as we think it ought to be, because it is just assumed that's there. In this innovation paradox, it clearly comes to the fore that it isn't there and it needs to be constructed. So that's part of the narrative that we're doing. And hopefully, we'll actually achieve something. So we're completely in the middle of this whole process. We haven't achieved the results yet that we hope to achieve, but we're very positive about the direction the project is taking. And we're enormously grateful for all the support that we're getting from the different groups in Gippsland. So that's it for now. Emma, you want anything to add? No? Okay.
Thank you, Leo and Lars. We'll take some questions now. Perhaps got 10 minutes. So if you could state your name and affiliation. So I'll start with Stephen. Come forward.
Hi. Thanks, I'm Stephen. I'm a PhD student here at the college. Thanks, that was really interesting. I've got a sort of question in two parts. And the first part is about innovation and sort of what forms innovation takes. And to prompt that a little, I'll refer to an island in Denmark, this renewable energy island of Samsø, where this sort of 10-year transition the community undertook to 100% renewable energy or thereabouts has been sort of termed by some sort of researchers and commentators as a example of participatory innovation. A very grassroots initiative that reflects a lot of these things you've talked about in terms of stakeholder participation, but sort of emerging from the bottom up in many respects. So to what extent does this sort of participatory innovation figure in the smart specialisation strategy in Gippsland, you know, beyond a sort of very, you know, technological sort of innovation that I think seems to be the norm? And then coupled with that, SAMSO is interesting because it's an island, and so it's a very sort of clearly defined community. But how big is a region? Is there a limit to regional innovation in terms of these sort of relationships and networks that seem quite integral to, you know, the conversations that you're talking about taking place? You know, and so is a region as much a sort of defined around a network as it might be defined around a sort of geography?
So yeah, it's interesting, the question about innovation. That seems to come back a lot here. And again, there seems to be different understandings between a European and an Australian understanding of innovation. I think the answer is our understanding, and the understanding of smart specialization of innovation is it's about the process more than about the actual form it takes as an outcome. And we've been sort of referring a bit here and there to the innovation systems, which again has become quite a mainstream concept in Europe, which emphasizes that innovation is not sort of the heroic act of an inventor, of a innovative firm, but it's something that sort of emerges out of interaction and out of collaboration between different organizations, between different individuals, between different sectors. So that's why within smart specialization, they sort of emphasize the notion of entrepreneurial discovery process. It's about discovering what the innovations could be that are relevant and significant for a region in question. And for some, that could be very much social innovation. For some, that could be very much technology. And that also sort of, you know, is really an open-ended question about which sectors are involved in innovation. And that's sort of a similar sort of open-ended sort of approach, I think, is with regard to how you define the region. Again, you know, in Europe, you would have a longer history of regionalism, and the administrative sort of structures often sort of follow, you know, real lived sort of regional communities. Whereas, you know, in the New World, the way that regions are constructed are, you know, more recent and maybe don't have that sort of legacy and sort of that institutional history. So that obviously creates some challenges. But still, I mean, our experience in Gippsland is it's not so much about the administrative boundaries, but it is, as you say, sort of the networks that are being shaped and that sort of constitutes, you know, where the boundaries of a region are. And I mean, Gippsland already is sort of quite a, you know, difficult region to pin down. I mean, it's sort of, it took us quite some time to find a map about Gippsland as such. You know, again, you'd find lots of local government areas, and you'd find the state of Victoria. But, you know, what actually is Gippsland and who speaks for Gippsland is difficult to answer. Leo, is something?
No, but we found the map. Oh, only took a year. Sorry.
More of a comment than a question, Lars. If we had the data on innovation in Gippsland and we had a list of patents registered in Gippsland, the answer would be 0. The reason for that is that all the patents are registered in Melbourne, if they exist. For the innovation triple helix, the firms, the government and the unis that have activities in Gippsland are all based external to Gippsland. So how can you build an innovation network in Gippsland when your key stakeholders are all not in Gippsland?
It's a real challenge. But I think starting with the notion of cooperation and collaboration, you actually can get somewhere. But it is really hard for an institution like Federation University to see itself as a portal, as a gateway where the other unis that we have in Victoria can bring their knowledge to bear on Gippsland, because it means sharing. And that's not something that we are naturally inclined to do. But we have made progress. I mean, when you talk about food and fiber agriculture, the expertise, the knowledge in sort of academic sense of the word is not necessarily in Federation University, but there are a series of unis across Victoria that have really, really good knowledge repositories that need to be made accessible for the Gippsland farming community. I mean, one of the key things that we came across is that you don't know what you don't know. And that's because universities are very difficult beasts to access for an individual farmer. And so we need to create mechanisms and vehicles and organizational structures that allow that information stream to go through. I mean, what we don't do is use our students as an instrument of knowledge sharing and knowledge transition. We don't put our Melbourne-based students on capstone projects in Gippsland. There's plenty of opportunity there, which would mean you start an information flow, a knowledge circle going on, and that can be enormously powerful. Yes, it takes some time, but it doesn't mean that it cannot be achieved because there is limited presence in Gippsland. It's about understanding that you can do interesting stuff there with the community, for the community, and by the community, but it's about collaboration.
And just to add, I mean, I agree with you that if you would do if you would rely on patent data, it wouldn't tell you very much. But I also would argue that patents is probably not, certainly not the only proxy for innovation. And what Europeans do very well is actually to also develop alternative metrics to have a more capacious understanding of innovation beyond patents, and really looking rather at capabilities of organizations and individuals at sort of, what skills do they have, rather than sort of focusing on, technology alone. So it's that kind of data that I think would be informing policymaking rather than patents. Sure, but yeah.
Another comment. My name is Dieter Brüggemann from the University of Bayreuth in Germany. I was born, by the way, next to the Ruhr area, which you mentioned as an example for a maybe successful transition. The lesson we learned, I think, is that although it sounds very easy, you should not forget the people who are working there. You lose one generation because it takes a long time to have this transition, this deep transition, industrial transition. One generation, maybe even two. It's not only a matter of compensating the money for unemployed people. It's to appreciate them, to give them the value that they are is still necessary. Their work was of value, and there is another work of value for them. I'm not sure about the social situation in Gippsland, but how many people are involved with that transition? And will this be a problem, and do you have a solution to this problem?
Well, I mean, it's actually quite interesting because we just finished, like I said, 2 weeks of workshops on new energy. And one of them was on geothermal and the potential that it has. I mean, it's a huge natural resource for Gippsland. And it's because the coal works as a magnificent blanket of insulation for water. So between, I think it was 50 and 100 meters or so, there's water of 70 degrees, which is perfect for your heating and for community heating and all that sort of stuff. It requires engineering capabilities to get that out. We actually have that engineering capacity because of the history of the coal mines. And so we can bore drills. We can drill bores, sorry. we know about heat pumps. We know how to deal with water, because the mines use an enormous amount of water. If we close the mines eventually, we actually will have a lot of water that's available for alternative use. It's actually a very good window of opportunity to make that transition from one form of energy to another form of energy because of the skills base that's there. I mean, engineering is still well developed in Gippsland. It may not be a complete transferable skills package, but it's certainly not so that you start from scratch. And yes, there's a cultural element to it as well, because as we've learned from other conversations with other people who run alternative energy industries or companies, it is not that easy to transition from what was a fairly well-paid and very well-structured job into something that's novel and requires a lot more energy, individual energy that is, to work, and people aren't always prepared to do that. But things are happening, and new jobs are being created at actually a fairly rapid rate. And we shouldn't forget about that as well. So this is not a story of dead end despair and disaster. It's also one where there's a lot of innovation potential, but there's also a lot that's already going on, particularly in the areas of new energy, including bioenergy, including the use of smart grids, community energy, power hubs, and all of that. It's not that nothing is happening there. It's about pulling it all together and, let's say, transitioning it to scale. That is the important challenge that we have.
Just to add one thing, it's again about data, but there's some interesting studies coming out of Europe of industries and regions that face decline. The region where I used to live, Skåne, used to be a real sort of shipbuilding region. And because in Sweden you have access to employee data, you can actually track where people that are going, that have been laid off. And what was coming out of studies done there was that a lot of the jobs that were lost in shipbuilding were absorbed actually in offshore wind industry that was emerging. And I think that sort of speaks to your point about not really forgetting about the people, both in terms of, support for difficult transition processes, political support, but also in terms of the skills that people have, and that being the resource for sort of, redevelopment and development of regions, the skills of people rather than, companies.
My name is Colin Long. I'm the Just Transitions Organiser for the Victorian Trades Hall Council, so the Victorian Union Movement. One of the issues that seems to me to be very important and needs consideration as probably a governance or an institutional issue is actually the industrial relations framework in Australia, which is, a major problem in talking about a decent transition. So I think one of the reasons why Turnbull's talk about innovation policy and innovation policy in general in Australia doesn't go too well, because when Turnbull talked about innovation, workers heard, "I'm losing my job," and that was about it. And I think it was Richard Sennett a long time ago with his Hidden Injuries of Class, I think, saying that the breakdown in the institutional structure for secure employment was leading to a broader breakdown in respect for institutions of society and so on. I think that's playing out all over the world now, especially in your early graphs or maps. For one of the big problems we're finding for unions at the moment about the transition and is that a lot of the jobs in renewables are not very good jobs, and a lot of the employers are not very good employers. And the pattern of contractor getting the work and then subbing it out and subbing it out and subbing it out, and then backpackers doing the work for $20 an hour. It's pretty hard to sell to coal miners as a job alternative. And that's being driven by state government renewable energy policy in many ways, the different ways that renewable energy is contracted for the contracts for difference or reverse auctions and so on. The prices are just ridiculously low now, and they're being driven too low for the procurement of renewable energy. I think it's a very substantial problem, and thinking about the problem of industrial relations, I think is, or the employment framework is really crucial to thinking about transition and innovation policy.
True. Though I think we also should not forget that the vast majorities of the SMEs in Gippsland don't employ staff. They're family businesses, essentially. So large employers are far and few between. In terms of, let's say, government policies and regulation, I think in each and every of the workshops that we've run, one of the issues have been regulation and how regulation is out of step with reality. In part, that I think is normal, because regulation normally follows what's happening outside and catches up with it. But certainly in terms of energy policy, I mean, it is quite disastrous. That is mad policy, and it's completely out of touch with the developments in the energy sector. I mean, when we were having the workshop on, I think, smart grids, one of the guys looked on his phone and said, "Do you know what the price of energy at the moment is in South Australia?" No idea. Minus $1,000. And that's because it was a day when there was a lot of sun and a lot of wind. So there's an enormous overproduction of energy. So that's completely out of step with reality. And we urgently need a rethink and an update in that domain. And I think that will help. And it's not that policymakers don't understand. They do. But they have their own realities to deal with as well. And in that sense, policy change isn't on a daily basis. It takes time, but it's being considered. So I think collectively we are moving in the right direction, but it takes time. And I do agree that especially in industries that are doing it a bit tough, it's easy to go to the default of let's have backpackers do it for $20 or $15 or $10, or use illegal labor for that matter, because we've seen that happening as well. But it's not the whole story, I would argue.
I see a few more hands up. Unfortunately, we've run out of time. We're already up past 12 o'clock. I'm sure Lars and Leo will be happy to stick around for a few minutes if anyone's got any additional questions for them. Before I finish, I just want to point to two other seminars which are somewhat relevant to the topic we're talking about today. The first is from Tiffany Harrison, talking about the role of local government in tackling the climate emergency. That's co-hosted with Beyond Zero Emissions. That'll be on next Monday at 6:30 at Fritzlow. And today, oh God, no wonder I haven't finished my PhD. I don't even know what time it is. Then next Wednesday is Rochelle Meyer, a former PhD of ours, achieving net negative emissions in the productive agricultural sector. So that's probably another area we've probably neglected in this country. Again, thank you for sticking around. Keep an eye on our events page. If you want to chat to Leo and Lars, you can do so. And a big round of applause for our special hosts.